So in our last video, we talked about the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, how the tide turned at Stalingrad in 1942. As one student remembered it, the German invaders were popular for a while in Russia, but their habit of slaughtering innocent civilians tended to give them an image problem. The Russians defended Stalingrad fiercely, as the city was named after Lenin. Okay. I just want to say something real quick about, because oftentimes in the West, when I say the Western world, I mean the English-speaking world, we tend to focus on the Second World War very much from the point of view of the United States and from the United Kingdom, and the war on the Western Front, with the culminating at the D-Day invasion in 1944. But I want to give you some scale that in reality, the heart of the war, the main war was fought in the East between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. I just want to give you some kind of scale of that by looking a little bit at the casualties from 3 or 4 of the main countries who were involved. So here we first start with France. France had over 200,000 military fatalities and almost 400,000 civilian fatalities. That reflects the fact, of course, that France was defeated quite quickly, but France was occupied by the Nazis for several years. So that's why there's more civilian casualties than military ones. United Kingdom, so we obviously has more military fatalities, almost 400,000 military fatalities. And 67,000 civilian fatalities. Most of those fatalities, of course, came from the Nazi Blitz against Britain. That is, the Nazis, after they kind of lost the Battle of Britain, began bombing British cities, and with about 40,000, I think, civilians were killed in Britain from late 1940 into early 1941 by these air campaigns that the Nazis launched. The United States, of the three, has the most military casualties, so over 400,000 military fatalities and civilian fatalities. Obviously much less because the United States, certainly the continental United States, didn't really come under attack during the Second World War, so only 12,000. So what do we have? We have the French, about 300,000, the British, about 400,000, the United States, about 400,000 military fatalities. How does that compare with the Soviet Union? 11,400,000 military fatalities. So the Soviets essentially lose 11 million more soldiers than any of the other Allied nations. And on top of that, 10,000 civilian fatalities. So the main point I'm going for is that I think this demonstrates the ferocity of the war, the scale of the war that was fought in the East. There simply wasn't a comparison with what happened in the West. That's not to say that the Western Front was unimportant. That's certainly not what I mean. But it's worth bearing in mind that the Soviet Union fought against Nazi Germany from June 1941 until May 1945. For the most part on the Western Front, with the exception of the aerial campaign between the British and the Germans, there's not an enormous amount of fighting, certainly in Western Europe. North Africa is different. The Allies do invade North Africa in 1942. But the big point I'm going for is I think we oftentimes in the West downplay or kind of think of the Eastern and Western fronts as kind of equally important. But really the heart of the war was fought in the East, and that's why the Soviets suffered appalling casualties in fighting the Nazis, and most of the Nazi fatalities were also on the Eastern Front as well. And that's actually something that marks the Second World War out as different from previous wars, certainly different from the First World War, in terms of that there was a great willingness on the part of many nations, particularly the Nazis, but not exclusively the Nazis, to target civilians as well. And this was partly due to ideological belief. Obviously, the Nazis had a racial hierarchy worldview in which they saw themselves as kind of superhuman, as they saw other people as inferior, as Untermenschen, subhuman, to use their term. And from the Nazi point of view in particular, it was permissible to use essentially mass murder of civilians towards gaining victory, and in fact for the Germans, not just even gaining victory, for kind of social engineering. The most obvious example of this, of course, is the Holocaust, which we'll talk about more in our next video. But in general, just a willingness to slaughter civilians. I think one figure I've heard before is that during the First World War, 90% of the fatalities were soldiers, 10% were civilians, and in the Second World War that's almost reversed, in which populations are very happy to attack civilians in order to advance their goals. The Nazis bombed British cities, and that was a tactic today we think of warfare, we think of aerial warfare as just a part of war. That had not necessarily been, there had been in the 19th century very much an idea that attacking civilians wasn't part of warfare. The kind of unofficial rules of war was that you only attacked other armies. Now, if you go back further in time to things like the 30 Years' War, yes, there was certainly a willingness to attack civilians as well. That had kind of gone out of style in the 18th and 19th century, that where warfare was primarily between armies. But in the Second World War, there's a greater willingness to use war against civilians in order to achieve victory. The Germans had actually tried to bomb London using air balloons in the First World War, but they launched massive attacks on civilians in British cities. The German Blitz from 1940 to 1941, I think I mentioned, killed about 40,000 people. Most of them in London, not exclusively. The Nazis destroyed the city of Coventry during the Second World War. In fact, they inflicted so much damage on Coventry, it became a word in the German language, the Coventryize, to kind of totally obliterate something. And when the Allies had the same advantage, they returned this tactic in full on upon the Germans. The Allies were very willing to use mass bombings upon German cities, including German cities that oftentimes had no real military or industrial kind of importance. It was simply killing German civilians for the sake of killing German civilians. And I'm not necessarily commenting on the morality one way or the other of that, but it's worth bearing in mind that it wasn't just the Nazis who thought it was okay to kill civilians in order to achieve victory. The best example, of course, in the Allies was the decision to drop the atomic bombs upon the Japanese cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I know that in United States history, that's generally accepted. That was necessary, and I'm not trying to challenge that view exclusively, but just worth bearing in mind that, of course, from the point of view of our side of the Western side of this, the tactics always seem acceptable. From the Nazi side, obviously always seem unacceptable. But if you sit down and look at them in the cold, rational light of analysis, maybe sometimes they weren't always all that different. I'm not saying the Allies were the equivalent of Nazis in all ways. They clearly weren't. There certainly was no Allies Holocaust or anything like that. But part of the brutality was that the Allies were willing to match the Nazis and the Japanese to an extent in their war against civilians as well. In pushing east, the Nazis had executed hundreds of thousands of Poles in order to clear them off the land to give to German farmers as part of this Lebensraum project. So again, that's what I mean, that for the Nazis in particular, it wasn't just about killing the civilians of their enemies to achieve victory. It was partly because the Nazis were trying to mold a new vision, a new society that they imagined would emerge in the post-war period. Both the Germans and the Russians in particular gained reputations of being incredibly brutal towards one another. I mentioned the fact that there was 11 million Soviet casualties. 3 million of those were prisoners of war, where the Nazis essentially worked the Soviet prisoners to death or starved them to death in cruel conditions. And the Russians returned the favor when they captured Nazi soldiers. And then we don't talk too much about this because, we're more focused on the war from the point of view of Europe. But the Japanese essentially occupied China from 1931, so 9 years before the beginning of the war, up until 1945, and inflict horrible casualties upon the Chinese. Used systemic mass rape as a tactic, used incredible brutality against the Japanese. And some scholars, all the figures I've given you, of course, so far are broadly estimates because it's hard to have exact figures given the scale of the slaughter that took place. But some scholars estimate that as many as 30 million Chinese people were murdered or were killed as a result of Japanese military activity in China from 1931 to 1945. So a very, very brutal war, in particular in China, but in general the Second World War was marked for its general barbarity towards civilians, oftentimes who were not engaged in combat at all. The tide of war turns. We mentioned obviously Stalingrad is a key defeat. After Stalingrad, the Nazis are in retreat. They simply are not able to fight back or to kind of staunch the flow of Soviet advance, partly because there were more Soviet soldiers and partly because the Soviets are simply better armed, better equipped. Unlike the First World War, in the First World War, the Russians were numerically superior. They were not. They didn't have the matching technology or weapons, but they do have it in the Second World War. The Nazi best hope for a Nazi victory in the East would have been a quick victory. The longer the war goes on, the more it plays into the hands of the Soviet Union, and the more it becomes inevitable that the Nazis will be defeated. Of course, as you're all familiar, the United States enters the war in 1941 when the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. The Japanese were interested in expanding further in Asia. They were worried that the United States at some stage would try and stop them from doing so, and therefore took the decision to carry out a preemptive attack upon the United States in 1941. Germany immediately declared war, well, not immediately, within a week declared war on the United States. People often ask me, why did Germany declare war on the United States? It seems like that was only adding to its problems. But basically, Hitler's attitude was great powers declare war on others. They don't have war declared upon them. It was obvious. I mean, the United States under Franklin Roosevelt had been very sympathetic to the Russians or to the Soviet Union and to the United Kingdom already. It was obvious they were going to enter the war anyway after this Japanese attack. And therefore, Hitler decided just to preempt them by declaring war himself upon the United States. Now, of course, the United States is not immediately able to send soldiers across to Europe. In fact, the United States Army in 1940 is quite small. It's the 16th largest army in the world in 1940. Places like Romania and Poland actually have much larger armies than the United States. But what the United States is able to send is equipment and financial aid, which they had already been doing through something called the Lend-Lease project prior to 1941, which was Roosevelt's way of trying to get around Congress to provide some kind of support for the Allies. But the nature of their aid, the scale of the American aid increases after the attack on Pearl Harbor. American soldiers do begin to move across the Atlantic in 1942, and the point of this is to set up a second front to assist the Soviets who, as we saw in terms of casualties, are bearing the entire brunt of the war in 1942-1943. There was great anger in the Soviet part, and one actually plays a contributing role in the outbreak of the Cold War after the First World War. The Soviets feel that the Allies, the British and the Americans are kind of stalling. They're not invading France basically as quickly as they can. The Soviets feel that the British and the Americans are allowing the Germans to weaken the Soviets first before they come to help. So the Soviets are expecting the Americans and British to attack in France in 1942. They are not able to do so. I mean, basically, the Dwight Eisenhower and the Allied commanders, their attitude is we have only one chance to invade France. We need to do it properly. France is incredibly heavily defended. Therefore, we need to build up enough troops, build up enough tactical sophistication and reconnaissance in order to ensure that our attack on D-Day is a success. But there's this tension between the Russians constantly demanding the Allies attack and the Allies trying to build up for an offensive in France. In 1943, the Allies, the Allies land troops in North Africa in late 1942. From this base in North Africa, they invade Italy in 1943 and are able to topple Mussolini and knock Italy out of the war in 1943. So they do open up a new front in Europe, but not the main front in Western Europe, in France, as the Soviets are hoping for. But by 1943, it's very kind of clear that the war is turning against Germany and its defeat is inevitable, or as one student remembered. The Allies landed near Italy's toe and gradually advanced up her leg, where they hoped to find Mussolini. And they did find Mussolini. Mussolini actually was eventually he was deposed by the Italian king. He was then rescued by the Nazis from an Italian prison. The Nazis put him in charge of the Republic of Northern Italy, a kind of puppet state they set up to help defend Northern Italy from the Allied advance. And eventually Mussolini in 1944 was captured by Italians who were sick of the war and lynched and left hanging upside down with his mistress from a lamppost. So eventually Mussolini is killed and Italy is taken out of the war.